This is a country of just 3.5 million people, situated right on the stunning Caucasus mountain range. It is also one of the most geopolitically important democracies on Earth. Or is it still? Now, modern Georgian politics has always been a debate about one main question. Can Georgia escape from Russia's orbit and fully integrate with the rest of Europe? That question has also shaped protests, elections, and wars, even the very identity of the country itself. Now today, Georgia sits directly between two competing worlds, the European Union on one hand and Russia on the other. Welcome to Politics, and this is Georgia Explained.
Thousands of demonstrators have returned to the streets of the Georgian capital Tbilisi for a second night of protest.
Some of my compatriots died here from snipers' bullets. They were part of protesters.
NATO and the U.S. are among those calling for an immediate ceasefire.
Citizens of the United States were present, and if this is the case, then the suspicion arises that someone in the United States has on purpose created this conflict.
And I think that this country needs continuity, needs somebody to represent it. Today, at this moment, I am that person.
Now, Georgia is small, but geographically it sits at an extremely strategic location. It connects Europe to the Caucasus and Central Asia. Major oil and gas pipelines run through this area, and historically, empires have fought over it for centuries. The Persians, Ottomans, and Russians all wanted control of this very land, and with Georgia eventually becoming a part of the Soviet Union in 1921. For decades, Moscow controlled nearly every aspect of Georgian political life, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Georgia became independent. That independence, however, came at a cost. Civil war, economic collapse, corruption, together with stark race and separatist conflicts in regions like Abkhazia and South Ossetia, have immensely shaped the very nature of Georgian politics. Now, Russia here is obviously the elephant in the room, backing both separatist movements and eventually using them to maintain influence over newly independent Georgia. Though this here is also really significant, as it would go on to shape post-Soviet Russian policy towards neighboring states, Ukraine in particular. But that's probably a topic for a different video. Now, by the early 2000s, many Georgians have completely lost patience with the political system. The economy remained weak, corruption was deeply entrenched, all while organized crime networks continued to maintain enormous influence over everyday life. Public institutions barely functioned, and public trust in the government was consequently collapsing. Then came the parliamentary election of 2003, when allegations of electoral fraud emerged. Protests erupted across the country. Though unlike many protests of the post-Soviet world, this movement quickly transformed into something much larger. Young students, opposition politicians, and the civil society groups began organizing around the idea that Georgia needed a complete political reset. Demonstrators carrying roses stormed the parliament peacefully, demanding the resignation of the president Eduard Shevardnadze. And with these images becoming internationally famous, eventually Shevardnadze stepped down. The movement became known as the Rose Revolution, and for many Georgians it represented far more than just a transfer of power. It symbolized a generational break from the corrupt Soviet-style political system that had dominated the country since independence. And leading this new generation was Mikhail Saakashvili. He's young, charismatic, educated in the West, and openly ambitious about transforming Georgia into a modern European state. Though his political project was aggressive and highly ideological, he wanted to rapidly modernize the country, centralize state authority, eliminate corruption, and attract foreign investment, moving Georgia decisively towards the West. Initially, the results were striking. Georgia became internationally known for its anti-corruption reforms, bribery inside of the police force dropped dramatically, and public services indeed improved. Infrastructure expanded, and foreign investment started paying attention to Georgia in ways that they've never did before. Now, for a period of time, Georgia became one of the most celebrated reform success stories of the former Soviet Union. But Saakashvili's government also developed a harder and more confrontational side to it. Critics accused him of concentrating power around the presidency, weakening opposition voices, and increasingly treating politics as a zero-sum struggle between patriots and enemies. And as Georgia moved closer to NATO and the West, tensions with Russia also escalated. Eventually, those tensions would explode into war.
Russian tanks are rolling through the streets of South Ossetia Friday. It comes after Georgia launched a major military offensive to regain control of the breakaway republic.
I have been watching the Georgian president on TV, affirming that he would stay the course. And he is doing this with not only a Georgian flag behind his back, but also with the flag of the European Union. I believe this doesn't require any comment.
Now, relationship with Russia reached a point of no return in 2008. Tensions between Georgian forces and Russian-backed separatists in South Ossetia escalated into open war. Georgia attempted to retake the region militarily, while Russia responded with overwhelming force. Russian troops invaded Georgia, and although the war lasted only a few days, the consequences were significant. Russia recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states, with Russian troops remaining stationed there today. As of right now, around 20% of Georgia's territory is effectively under Russian occupation, with this war also transforming Georgian politics. For many Georgians, it confirmed a fear that Russia would never tolerate a fully independent Western-aligned Georgia, but at the same time, it also revealed Georgia's vulnerability. Now, the West supported Georgia politically, but NATO did not intervene militarily. It remained silent on that note, and that really still shapes Georgia's foreign policy today. Georgia wants closer integration with the West, but at the same time, balancing against a much stronger Russia is not an option, but rather a matter of survival. Now, for some Georgians, Saakashvili remained the leader who dragged the country out of corruption and dysfunction. For others, however, he had become increasingly authoritarian despite having a pro-European background. And that political frustration eventually created an opening for a new political force. In 2012, a coalition called the Georgian Dream defeated Saakashvili's party in a parliamentary election. Leading the movement was billionaire businessman Bidzina Ivanishvili. Now, despite many Georgians seeing him as a prominent figure of change, Ivanishvili had indeed made much of his fortune in Russia during the chaotic post-Soviet 90s, making early critics see him as a potential ally of the Moscow regime. Now, with all that being said, the Georgian Dream promised stability and less confrontation with Russia, which prompted him much support from many Georgians who were at this point simply tired of war. His message was carefully balanced, however. Georgia, as he argued, should continue pursuing integration with Western Europe and maintain a strong relationship with the West. But at the same time, he also argues that Georgia should avoid provoking Russia unnecessarily. And on top of this change in policy, the election, on the other hand, was also historically important. It represented the very first time since independence when Georgia experienced a peaceful democratic transfer of power through elections, not war or revolution. Now, international observers largely praised the transition. Initially, the Georgian Dream Party continued many pro-European policies. Georgia signed major agreements with the European Union, trade and tourism expanded, and the government continued presenting EU membership as a long-term national goal. Over time, however, concerns about the direction of Georgian democracy began growing. critics started accusing Georgian Dream of slowly concentrating power while weakening independent institutions and increasing informal political control behind the scenes. The very same ideas they presented themselves to counter at the beginning of 2012. And much of that criticism centered around Ivanishvili himself. Although he repeatedly announced his retirement from politics following his first term as president, many Georgians believe that he still remained the country's most influential political figure, operating informally from behind the scenes rather than through official office. Now, Georgia under Georgian Dream has continued cooperating with Western institutions, but many now increasingly believe that the government wants the economic and diplomatic benefits of closer European ties without fully committing the democratic reforms and political openness expected by the EU. And as tensions between Russia and the West intensifies, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, those contradictions inside Georgian politics becomes much harder to ignore. Now, the government responded that Georgia simply could not afford another war, and honestly, this reflects one of the deepest dilemmas in modern Georgian politics. Georgia wants integration with Europe, but geographically, Russia is still there. Economically, militarily, and politically, Moscow still has enormous leverage over the country, as Russia remains an important trade partner of the country. Russian tourists also contribute heavily to Georgia's economy, and most apparently, the military. Russian troops remain stationed inside of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, extremely close to key Georgian infrastructure and major transportation routes. Now, by this point, almost every Georgian government faces the same impossible balancing act. Push too aggressively towards the West and risk provoking Russia, or move too cautiously and face angering a population that overwhelmingly wants a European future. Despite all those external pressures, though, support amongst the population for joining the European Union remains extremely high, because for many Georgians, Europe represents far more than economics. It represents democracy, institutional stability, personal freedom, and most importantly, security from Russian dominance. It represents the kind of country they want Georgia to become. In 2023, Georgia officially received European Union candidate status, and that was a major symbolic victory for the country. It also came with conditions, though. The EU demanded reforms involving judicial independence, media protection, and anti-corruption measures, and this is where tensions inside Georgia becomes even sharper. Many opposition groups, journalists, and civil society organizations increasingly believe that the government was not fully committed to these democratic reforms necessary for European integration, with that conflict soon erupting into one of the biggest political crises in modern Georgian history. Now, in 2023 and again in 2024, the Georgian government introduced a controversial legislation commonly referred to as the Foreign Agents Law. This proposed law required organizations receiving significant funding from abroad to register with the government as an organization serving a foreign interest. Government officials argued that the legislation was simply about transparency, but most saw through this. Many believe that the law closely resembled the legislation used in Russia to suppress independent media, opposition voices, and civil society. Almost immediately, massive protests erupted throughout Tbilisi, with tens of thousands of demonstrators flooding the streets and carrying flags of Georgia and the European Union, the very ideologies they represent and found for. Right on, atmosphere became intense. Police began deploying tear gas and water cannons to disperse the crowd as clashes broke out between protesters and security forces. And very quickly, the demonstrations became about far more than just a piece of legislation. Now, for many Georgians, the protests symbolize a much bigger fear that Georgia was somehow slowly drifting away from Europe and towards a more authoritarian political model resembling that of Moscow's. The symbolism of the EU flag during the protest was especially important, as many demonstrators were not simply protesting against the government. They wanted a declaration of what they believed Georgia's future should look like: European, democratic, and independent from Russia's influence. Now, at the same time, supporters of the government accused parts of the opposition of trying to destabilize the country and inflame tension. This now reflects another major characteristic of modern Georgian politics: extreme polarization, with politics inside of Georgia feeling increasingly divided into competing visions of national survival. One side believes that Georgia must move decisively towards Europe before Russian influence becomes overwhelming, while the other feels that Georgia should instead move in a cautious manner in avoidance of provoking the elephant in the room. And between those two positions now sits a deeply divided society. Now, we've talked quite a bit about Georgia, but really, why does it matter so much? Georgia may appear small geographically, but strategically speaking, its politics matters enormously. The country sits at the crossroads of Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East, with major oil and gas pipelines passing through the territory, allowing energy exports from the Caspian region to reach Europe while bypassing Russia. That makes Georgia's geography immensely important to both Europe and Russia. Politically speaking, however, Georgia has also become one of the clearest examples of how the wider struggle against Russian influence is happening across the former Soviet world. A struggle between Russian influence, Western integration, and national sovereignty. Unlike in many larger powers like the US or Germany, these debates are not abstract in Georgia. People there have lived through invasion, economic collapse, occupation, revolution, and the constant geopolitical pressure within a single generation. That history shapes everything about Georgian political culture today. It makes politics emotional, highly polarized, and deeply connected to the question of national identity and survival. Because for many Georgians, politics is not simply about taxes or party platforms. It's about the very future direction of the country itself.
I'm not surprised. Actually, when in 2008 Georgia was invaded by Moscow, by Russian army, I was warning prior to that invasion that first Georgia will come and then Ukraine will come. Putin is following his blueprint all the way through, and actually, it happened both times during or around the time of Olympics. Then it was Beijing Olympics, and now it's Sochi Olympics. And actually, the blueprint is exactly the same as they applied in Georgia.
Now, modern Georgia is a country that's suspended between two worlds. Politically and culturally, much of the population sees its future in Europe, but geographically and militarily, Russia remains impossible to ignore. And that tension defines nearly every major aspect of political debate inside of the country today. Can Georgia depend on democracy while maintaining stability at the same time? Can it integrate into Europe without provoking Russia? Or can a small post-Soviet state truly escape the orbit of a much larger neighbor? Nobody fully knows the answer yet, but what happens in Georgia continues to matter far beyond the Caucasus, because Georgia has become a test case for whether countries living next to Russia can successfully build democratic, European-oriented political systems while facing enormous external pressure. And for millions of Georgians, it's not just a geopolitical question. It is a question that will define their very own future. Hey there, if you made it this far through in the video, you're truly invested in the topic, just like I am. But I genuinely do appreciate you guys for watching this far down. I know it's quite a long video, it's 20 minutes, so if you're here, I do appreciate your support. But just one last thing before I let you guys go. If you could please leave a like and subscribe to our channel and show some support for independent journalism there, I would really appreciate it. Because I know you guys might already know this, it's really a lot of work that we put into these videos. Every single one of them takes days to produce, days of scripting, editing, and sourcing the data, so we would really appreciate it if you could show some support by subscribing. Now, if you've done that, we really do appreciate you again for staying till this far, and I'll see you in the next video.